Oh boy, here we go again. There's a lot happening in the world of unionism, and it's happening right in front of our eyes. The National Labor Relations Board is operating with a full 5-member board for the first time in nearly a decade. We are expecting more action on quickie elections, more organizing activity from unions. We've seen a rather large faction from the Change to Win, the United Food and Commercial Workers, switch sides back over to the AFL-CIO. Today I'm joined by Ricardo Torres, a former high-level union official who's currently the president and CEO of Permanent Solutions Labor Consultants right here in the Motor City. Torres now spends his career working with management and positioning them to use positive employee relations as a tool to make union-free part of our clients' corporate DNA. I am also joined by Randy Stevenson, a seasoned labor attorney out of Omaha, Nebraska. Randy is a senior partner at the Baird Home Law Firm. I'm also joined by a regular guest, Cliff Hammond, a former SEIU attorney who now works exclusively with management. Together, we will be discussing what is happening now as we wind down the summer of 2013, and we'll make some predictions on how the current labor movement will shift in the not-so-distant future. My name is Bob Carroll. I'm the Executive Vice President of Permanent Solutions Labor Consultants and your host for today. This is PSLabor Talk. Rick, Randy, Cliff, how you doing today?
Doing great.
Doing well, thanks.
Doing well, Bob. Thank you.
Well, let's start off talking about fast food. There's been some interesting developments in fast food recently. The unions have called for a national day of strikes, a doomsday national day of strikes, if you will. Cliff, why don't you give us a little bit of insight in this? What's going on here?
Well, number one, you've got around 3 million people who don't make a lot of money, and they're unorganized. So they're a great target for unions. Traditionally, these are low-wage earners. Unions have not been successful and really haven't put a lot of effort into organizing this group for a lot of reasons. Because, one, you have a lot of people who are part-time. Two, they're younger, they move, they're transient, and they just haven't been that big target in the sky. But what has happened is that you're seeing more and more effort being brought by labor unions and non-traditional groups to go out and try to organize this group because you have such a large group of people and you have this low-wage issue. So what you're seeing today is an opportunity to kind of meld together the union idea of organizing, getting lots of members, along with some other social groups who say, hey, a living wage, minimum wage really isn't there, and let's try to see if we can drum up some support, get some publicity, and the National Day of Strike is a way to bring attention to a group that seems to be, in their opinion, underpaid and disenfranchised from the rest of the sector of the economy. So that's why the unions are coming after them, because they're an opportunity. It's a large opportunity, and they have a lot of social reasons why they can do it, because wages are part of the issue, but not the only issue.
Rick, I know you've done some work when you were on the union side preparing to bring fast food into the union's radar. Can you give us some idea of what you did when you were on the side and how you see that playing with what's going on today?
Well, yeah, Bob, years ago, when I was working with the AFL-CIO director of organizing, Richard Bensinger, we put together a program to target fast food at the George Meany Institute. We built the curriculum for it, and actually, and a lot like healthcare, it's an easy target. One of the first things is like Cliff was saying, is that all the low wages, actually the injury rate is high there, turnover rate is high. You have young people which tend to have more idealistic purposes in organizing, more energy, and put together a program to go after the healthcare. And another thing is a public place. You can actually go inside the facility and organize, so it's really easy to have access to the workers. And years ago, we put together a very aggressive outline of how unions could organize these workers. And I think what they're doing now, and at the time we were also working with healthcare, and healthcare was what all the unions were putting their attention on at the time. But I think that what they did, what it looks like, is that they dusted off the books, and now they're re-looking at it, because you have millions of workers. And in these communities, in a lot of the inner city communities, where it would be an easy win for them to go in there and organize these workers, especially when you're dealing with a lot of these emotional issues. And some of the things that have changed now also is because you have a lot of single moms, you have a lot of single parents who are it's their only ways to support the family. A lot of these inner city areas also where people are walking to work and are ready to fight. And like Cliff said, building the whole theme around one directive. Livable wage. People are working hard. They should make a decent living, and it sounds really nice. It sounds good. So it's like a rallying cry.
And let's face it, the owners of these fast food chains aren't well versed in labor relations. They're not well versed in dealing with unions. Randy, what can they do and what can they learn now to help them prepare for these union attacks?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've had a few clients ask me, and they're probably in the top 5% because they understand that there's an issue and they want to know what the rules are. I think probably 95% of the folks out there who own these guys or franchise chains don't know what the rules are. And my biggest fear is that if a group of employees at a fast food restaurant get up and walk out, that could be protected concerted activity. A lot of employers will say, well, gee, that just disrupted my operations, or they violated my attendance policy by doing that, and I'm going to take discipline. And my caution to those employers is make sure to talk to your full counsel before doing anything, because I mentioned it could be protected concerted activity. Now, a lot of these not protected concerted activity. I mean, break that down. Protected concerted activity. Well, first of all, is it concerted? If it's one employee, well, it may not be. But if you've got two or more, could be concerted. Is it protected? Well, sometimes I've had a situation once where at a fast food establishment, the owner called me and he said, these guys are sitting down in my lobby. They're not leaving. Well, that's not protected. Or they've left, but they're blocking the entrance. That's not protected. Or really, they're trying to be recognized by some union that's pushing. That is not protected. But the caution is, these are very complicated rules. My caution to employers in the fast food industry is, first of all, try to get yourself in a position. Don't have employees walking out by practicing good labor relations, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a moment. But if it happens, don't be quick to take discipline. Talk to your counsel first.
Yeah. That absolutely, right? Spot on, Randy. One of the things that when we were putting together the plan with the AFL-CIO was that there's no way we would take action unless it was a mass action. I mean, it would have to be, a good majority, if not all, the workers within the restaurant. Second of all, the whole goal was to, and you can fire a worker, or you can, take actions, but the whole goal was to hurt the franchisee to the point to where once again, and this is similar to other organizing campaigns also, but to hurt him to the point to where, they have to say uncle, they have to say, listen, we're having a hard time getting good workers in here. We have to do something. It's either close down or recognize the union. Another thing with these restaurants or these franchise, like McDonald's or Burger King, it's so easy to salt and to put troublemakers within the facilities and to kick up a lot of dirt within. So I mean, that's another weakness.
And I think Randy hit a very salient point here, and that is you have to talk to somebody who knows what the rules are, because in this particular situation, we are seeing the rules somewhat changed as far as the organizing tactics. There are traditional ways that you organize, and we can handle that. What's concerted, what's not concerted, help out employers. The problem is that what we're seeing in this type of debate is that the union themselves is really not organizing most of these. It's a non-union entity. And what they're trying to do is take advantage of the fringe of the law. There are protections that are out there for employers for certain types of activity that people would take in a union setting, secondary boycott, secondary picketing. that may not necessarily affect a group of people that are in a nonprofit organization, such as the Restaurant Opportunity Committee, or some of these other groups that are being started, funded, large part by unions or other people that are sympathetic in the environment of the inner city. So people that are trying for a living wage, $15 an hour wage, something like that, they're going to go in and they're going to make a lot of noise, and they're going to bring their own people, and they're going to stand up. They're going to do certain things that may or may not be union activity. And so it may look like a strike, it may look like a picket, but the reality is there are different rules, and it's making it very complex, and it's bringing attention to the group. And when you have people mad and you bring this attention, you have an opportunity to, like Rick said, I mean, the point is you get access, and maybe you can sign a union card while you're there. So the union president's going to be there, but they're going to say, oh, it's not union activity. This is a non-union organization that's doing this in support of a living wage. So there are complexities out there. I mean, we're looking at some of these places like The Rock. It had around a $3 million budget. And so you've got a lot of money to be put out here to be done. And AFL-CIO is sponsoring a number of these work centers, which are not unions. They're places people go. They pay maybe an affiliation fee, and they come out there and talk about their workplace problems, but it's not a union. And they're not paying taxes because they're nonprofit. They have that status. And some are even applying for and receiving grants from the federal government or from the state to help do these initiatives within the into the city. So it is a difficult, complex area.
You know, Cliff, this is what we've had this conversation many times. In fact, we've done a couple shows on it. Is that with, especially after the Occupy Wall Street, even though the Occupy Wall Street movement has really almost died, there's a lot of thoughts and ideas that have come from that. And one of them being, and we talked about this, is that how can a group of concerned or so-called concerned citizens affect how management or how companies react to labor issues? And we talked about, secondary boycotts. We talked about, labor laws as far as restricting, strikers on a strike line. And we talked about all kinds of other issues that are that are relative when it comes to how unions react with or interact with management. But a group of so-called concerned citizens can go in there and they have a whole different set of rules and regulations that they have to abide by. And pretty much they have the freedom to go in there as so-called concerned citizens and do a lot of things that unions can't. And it's hard to make that connection. Well, are they part of the union? If they're not, what rights do they have? So it's kind of putting a lot of the old rules and regulations on its head.
Randy, I got a question for you. I'd assume that if the unions are going after fast food workers, that there's some other non-traditional targets that they have in mind. Who else do you feel is at risk?
Well, I think potentially anyone, but where I see it is in the healthcare area. And traditionally, from a macro standpoint, unions didn't go after healthcare, but they've been going after it now for the last decade or so. So maybe it's now a traditional target. But we used to think of that as a non-traditional target. And we're seeing more and more organizing activity in healthcare, not only acute care hospitals, but especially in...
Randy? All right, we seem to have dropped Randy. Cliff, who do you see as a potential
Well, I
target?
see the same non-traditional groups that have been going for the last couple of years. So you're looking at home care workers, state-funded home care workers. You're looking at people that take care of the elderly through a Medicaid program. Taxi cab drivers, there's lots of those, and they have opportunities in an urban environment to be organized. I see a lot of professions that are dominated by women because there's going to be an outreach to traditional female roles that haven't been organized. I see doctors, and I see a new surge in trying to get graduate students. Traditionally, NLRB said no, they're more like students. But I see that the NLRB is looking like they may try to go after them, and that would be a tremendous group of people because you think about it, they're young, they're in a university setting, and universities have just grown tenfold in the last decade, so that would be another area, non-traditional area, that actually has been precluded that may open up. So those are my thoughts.
Guys, can you hear me? I'm back now.
Oh, okay.
Oh, great.
Welcome back, Randy.
I'm here. I can hear you.
The one other place that I could think of, and this is a non-traditional way of organizing, would be like a workers' council. There are talks. Volkswagen has workers' councils everywhere except for the United States. You can't do that here. But there are potentially ways to meld a non-traditional U.S. union with some of the German manufacturers and other manufacturers' ways to get dues and get representation while not a traditional union operation, but some sort of hybrid, or to have a non-majority union, which is what some of the unions, UFCW, is trying to get in some of the Walmart stores, which would be, even though we only have 30%, that 30% wants to be organized, and you have to represent us, which I don't believe is legal at this point in time by anybody's standard. But again, there will be an attempt to try to get that recognized, I think, over the next couple of years.
Well, I tell you, speaking of the United Food and Commercial Workers, a few weeks back, they separated ties with Change to Win. And they aligned themselves with the AFL-CIO. What significance does that have in their ability to organize? Why is this so important?
Well, one of the things, in fact, I predicted this a long time ago. In fact, the road to the AFL-CIO separating with like the SEIU. There was a 20-odd year battle between Richard Sweeney, or John Sweeney, and Andrew Stern that went on for years, and they have been fighting for years, and it kind of led to the point to where they separated. I was, in fact, Bob, we had this conversation many times to where now for the first time in years, actually a couple of decades, that those two leaders of that stress and that those problems within the AFL-CIO, neither one of them are in the labor movement anymore. I anticipate that within the next couple of years that the Change to Win is going to slowly come back and be back with the AFL-CIO. I predicted that for a while. I mean, the goal was to create another powerhouse, which it never really happened.
You have any insight, Cliff?
Well, I think that the key here is that you're gonna increase the dues. When I talk about dues, I'm saying the money that's going to flow from 1.3 million member union into the AFL-CIO. And the AFL-CIO, I think, would take that not only as part of their larger operating expenses, but they would be able to give their resources back to the UFCW. UFCW is trying to organize high publicity, Walmart and other big box stores. It would give more grassroots support for them. And I think it's a symbiotic relationship. You're going to have the opportunity to bring more money into the AFL-CIO's political strategy, which obviously at this point in time in this current administration would be successful, I think, for UFCW to put pressure on some of the players organizing targets. But at the same time, the AFL-CIO is going to get an influx of money to assist the UFCW in trying to organize. So I think it helps both of them. And like Rick said, ultimately it appears that with a lot of the hatchets being buried, you might see more of the traditional grouping of unions into one group, even if they're in nominally these two different factions. They'll work together more. In the short term, you might see some raiding, but I think long term, what you're going to see is because they're both on the same page, the administration's on their office, you have a full set of NLRB set to go and ready to make some rules that are favorable for unions. I think it just means full speed ahead.
Well, let's switch focus for a bit here. I want to talk about the National Labor Relations Board. They're at a 5-member status for the first time in, 10 years?
About a decade.
A decade.
10 years, yeah.
What's going on with the board? What's going on with the cases that were before the board before they could have an official quorum? Randy, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, the Noel Canning decision is going up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's granted cert, so we'll get some kind of a decision on that next year. I think there's a good chance that the Supreme Court will say that there was no quorum. So we're going to have a lot of cases. They're going to have to go through the pipeline again. But, I don't see that as being a huge deal in and of itself. I mean, we've kind of gone down this path before. When the board didn't have a quorum and they fixed things. I think the more significant thing, though, is now that there is a quorum and it's controlled by the Democrats and it's always controlled by the party of president. But I think we're going to see board do some things that it's tried to do but been unable to do thus far, like the quickie election rule. That's my biggest concern. Is now they've got a quorum, they can implement that rule. Up to now, when they implemented the rule, well, they didn't have a quorum, fine, it's an easy fix. I think the poster rule is going to be tougher unless they just really overhaul that, because the poster rule had some other substantive changes associated with it that the courts didn't like, such as tolling the limitations period if an employer didn't post it. But they could even theoretically redraft that. In my opinion, I'm not as worried if they get a poster rule passed. To a certain degree, I think it's just more white noise on the bulletin board at the workplace that employees don't focus on. Would I rather not have it? Sure. But I don't think that's the end of the world. My biggest concern is the quickie election rule. I think there's a good chance that we can see that come down the pike again.
I think you're right, Randy, and I am 100% behind that. I think the two biggest events is you've got a full contingent of 5. They're going to be there through the end of the administration. So I believe they're going to vote at some point in time on the quick election, even if it doesn't get upheld through the court. So they're going to re-vote, I think, at some point in time. And then the Sixth Circuit just came down and approved the specialty health care case, which essentially allows the micro units, a smaller group. So think about it. In just a few months, we might have real small units, real quick elections. And that would be a game changer. Whether unions can take advantage of it or not is not the point. The point is, it will set the stage that if unions have anything left in the tank, and if they have members out there that actually want to be organized, you just set the stage. And so that's what the 5-member group is about, because they're going to be the ones that are going to allow you to not only have a quick election, but you're not going to be doing objections up front. I mean, that the rules they're going to put in place are going to be implements and hurdles against employers to try to get in there and educate the employees. So you're going to have a quick election without objections up on the front end, and you're going to have smaller potential groups, because special healthcare may talk about healthcare, but there's a good chance that's going to grow out into other workplaces and environments, and so it's going to significantly change the landscape of who you can organize and how fast you can organize. And so by the time you get done with the current 5-member group, you really have changed the playing field. You really have, for the first time in decades, really significantly changed how you get organization running.
You know, when and Randy, I tell you, I don't really think that the unions are that concerned with the postings either. If they get this quick election, that's a golden age right there. Years ago, one of the mergers that I helped put together was with the Steelworkers and the Canadian Retail Association, and we had a 5-day election there. What they had opened us up to be able to do once we went in there and merged with them was to amass, large groups of organizing teams for a short amount of time. Because, I mean, right now it's very expensive for unions to take large groups of organizers to different campaigns. When we had the quick elections, we could do it real quick, take the workers out of the jobs on a lost time basis, and after they're trained, hit almost like guerrilla tactics as far as hitting companies for a short period of time with a lot of energy, with a lot of emotions, and then move on to the next one. The problem is, Randy and Cliff, you guys know as well as I do, is that the union has no limit for how much time they can be in there. And the company, many times, the company has no idea, that there's even union activity when they got hit with a petition. So now if you add that they get hit with it, now they have a short amount of time to be able to communicate with those employees and to be able to educate them on exactly what being a member of a union means. It's almost a disaster. We had a 93% win rate in Canada for the first year when I was working there with the retail workers, and it was like a hit and run guerrilla type strategy, and the energy was high, the emotions were high, and we could take our people from place to place real easy. So it's going to have a big effect on how unions organize.
Let's talk about some changes in labor law. So this is more for Randy and Cliff here, and Rick, of course, we welcome your opinion. What changes in labor law have we seen so far this year?
Well, I think the number one change in labor law really isn't the law itself. It's having the 5 members of this board, full contingent. There aren't going to be many questions left. There's some minor ones about whether general counsel should or shouldn't be there, but I don't think that's going to last. So you're looking at the legal environment changing, where you're going to have a lack of challenges other than the law. So that sets the stage, in my opinion, for going forward in 2013, not looking back at the decisions that we've had, because there are some important ones, but looking forward, what are we going to have, and the same things we just talked about. Most importantly, I think the Sixth Circuit's decision on the micro units, the smaller groups, that's a big deal. And if you don't appreciate how small it is, you can just look at the fact that you may have shoe salesmen on the second and third floor of a department store organized into a single group, as opposed to all the employees who sell things or all the shoe salesmen. I mean, it's fundamentally a different legal constraint. And I also see the issue, and it may or may not be upheld when we talk about the quorum as we go through with Noel Canning, but there is an issue out there whether or not just in organizing, but if you have a current union and the contract expires and you don't have a new contract, for decades, one of the economic tools that a company had in negotiations was that you had the right to cancel dues. You would not take dues out. You would just say, you know what, if you want to take dues, go ahead and pay it to your union individually. It's an economic component to try to get it done. And what the NLRB has done is said, actually, no, you can't do that. It's a mandatory subject to bargaining. Following the Ninth Circuit, they said, no, we're going to go ahead and force you to continue to pay that unless the union agrees otherwise, or you hit an impasse. That changes the economic leverage of negotiations. So you not only are seeing legal changes in the landscape of who's making the rules that are going to come out, you're seeing the bargaining unit change. They're going to change the rules most likely. And then once you get into a union, you're going to see it. So those are the things that I see in 2013 that are going to change the landscape of organizing and the landscape of negotiations. And they are fundamental differences from what we've seen over the last 30 years. And I think it's going to have an enormous effect on corporations and their ability to negotiate.
Randy?
Yeah, I had a client ask me probably a few weeks ago. He said, what's really different now? He said, administrations change and you get a Republican-controlled board and then you get a Democrat and one's pro-business and one's pro-labor, which is, first of all, it's fairly astute that the client recognized that and recognized that the board truly isn't this impartial arbiter of labor issues. Unlike courts that, even if you get a Democrat or Republican-controlled court, they usually abide by precedent and try to follow that. Obviously, it changes and can change over time. But the board's really never taken that position. And, in fact, if you look at the National Labor Relations Act, if you look at the very first or second paragraph in it, it says, it is the policy of the United States of America to encourage the practice and procedure of collective bargaining and employee organization. And I think a lot of us have forgotten that over time. That's actually written into the law, that the law favors unions. And we've kind of thought, well, it should be neutral. Well, the way it's written, it's really not. And we've seen throughout the year changes over time. I mean, my gosh, guys, how many times has the Weingarten rule with respect to non-organized workplaces changed? As to whether Weingarten rights, representative during, interrogation that could lead to discipline, that's bounced back and forth like a tennis ball. It changes depending on who the labor board is. But I agree with Cliff. Some of these things are big. The decisions are big. The micro units, that's a big change. Dues from strikers, that's a big change. The rules that they're promulgating or trying to promulgate are even bigger. The quickie election rule, the poster rule. Another thing we haven't talked about, and it's really not from the NLRB, it's from the Department of Labor, but it still flows down from the administration, is with regard to the Labor Management Reporting Disclosure Act, which is basically, if they have their way, will say that lawyers, for example, who give advice with regard to a speech or some communication that an employer will give to an employee, that those lawyers now have to report their activities to the government, which would have, I think, a real chilling effect on an employer's right to resist unions. But I think probably the one big area, when we look at this from the 35,000-foot level over time, it's different, is that the board has reached its tentacles well beyond traditional labor law. They're reaching into traditional employment law in non-unionized workplaces. Typically, up to this point in time, You really only had to worry about the NLRB if you had a union or you had a unionizing drive or whatever. Now, employers who don't have a union, the employers are not interested at all in a union. The board is messing around in their sandbox by saying, hey, look, because of protected concerted activity under Section 7 of the Act, employer, your social media policy is overly broad. It could tend to chill protected concerted activity, or your policy with regard to access to your premises is not good, or your confidentiality policy is not good, or even your at-will policy, which you've had in place for the last probably 100 years, is not good. That's where I see from the 35,000-foot level a real fundamental change in that the board is reaching out beyond unionized workplaces and union issues and really trying to affect every workplace pretty much in the country.
Well, it almost seems like the goal now is not to protect. I mean, it's also written into the law that the reason for existing is to protect the worker, not the unions, not management, but the workers themselves. Now it seems to be that they're changed their role. Now it's almost like it's an arm of the union. We want to set the stage up so it makes it easier for unions to organize. Whether whether it's the best thing for the employees or not, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, you take a look, and Randy's spot on about some of the goals of the NLRB to get outside traditional. I mean, you not only have these communication policies, electronic communication policies, but you have the NLRB essentially, if not clearly, renouncing some U.S. Supreme Court decisions on about what you can and can't say in a waiver agreement that you sign with somebody, whether they can bring a class action lawsuit or not against a company, whether union or not union, when you sign some kind of arbitration agreement. It's significant, and that's why that poster was such a big deal, because the poster was essentially going to be the flyer, the advertisement for the NLRB. If you got a problem, I don't care where you work, union or non-union, come on down and call us up. And so the fact that got stayed really put a little bit of a damper on their access to some employees. But if it's ever put out in any scope, the roadmap is there. They're trying to get any place and anywhere they can and use the NLRB and the NLRA to cover everyone.
Well, this is my favorite part, Rick. I want to talk to you about making some predictions. Rick, you always seem to be rather accurate with your predictions. So what do you see happening with the unions in the current labor movement in the next year, 2 years, 3 years down the line?
Well, I think the biggest thing, we talked about this during the show, is I think the biggest thing that's going to have an effect on organized labor over the next year is going to be the quickie elections. I think this is going to happen. I think it's going to put a lot of gas in the tank of the unions. They know that they want to shorten the election time. I think it's going to increase organizing tremendously, and with that added dues money is going to they're going to use it to influence Congress. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I think that's what's going to happen. I think there's going to be more condensing of different unions. I think the AFL-CIO and the Change the Win Federation are gonna slowly come back together. I see more mergers. I see less unions. I predict in the next couple of years that probably the UAW and the steelworkers are going to merge it in some way. Years ago I was part of the planning committee for the machinists, the UAW and the steelworkers that come and join together to be the nation's largest union. I think that as the UAW loses its influence within with the loss of their membership, and I think what's going to happen is that they're going to merge and they're going to come out a lot stronger. So I see these things happen, but I think the biggest thing is I think the shortened election span for organizing is going to have the largest influence.
This is for everybody. If the quickie election comes, do the unions make a comeback?
I think they're gonna. I think there's no doubt that they're going to become a lot stronger. I think one of the other things that's helping them with that is that they're just like with the Occupy Wall Street movement. I think there's something when I was with the unions that we were constantly working on is how to become relevant the younger crowd, and we took a lot of efforts to do that. I think with what happened when the Occupy Wall Street movement started, I think this was their ability to get in there and start working with a lot of younger people. I think they've done that fairly successfully. I think they're continuing to do that and working with other groups. And as was mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot of offshoots of unions that are going to start happening. So I think it's going to help them a lot. The question is that, Bob, that's the $100,000 question. Are they going to be able to become relevant to the younger group, the younger crowd that's coming up? And I see them making strides. You know, I mean, it's not answered yet whether they're going to be successful as far as influencing the younger people to the point to where they're going to really grow in their power again. But I think that they're going to reach a threshold to where they're going to be relevant, you know, for a long time into the future.
I think that the biggest thing you're going to see is labor isn't going to be afraid to lose. The win percentage is fairly high for elections right now, unions, with the exception of maybe the Teamsters. Most of the unions are being more selective. They're not filing as many petitions because they don't want to waste resources when they don't think they're going to win. Well, if you get a quickie election, you might have an increase in the amount of elections you're going to have. And unions are going to be willing to take the risk that in a quick election, they may be able to keep that majority that they had when they signed cards. So I feel there's going to be an uptick in the next year or two in drives because you're going to have the opportunity to. If you get that quickie election through, you can do a quick election, you can pour a little bit of money into it, and you can define who it is that you're going to go after more specifically. So I think that. I also think you're going to be more urban and you're going to be more southern because the urban areas are where they're trying to go after these restaurant workers. They're going after for people who are immigrants, they're disenfranchised, they're going out with community leaders, and I think they're going to try to continue to go there. And I think as far as the win percentage, all you've got to do is win small and you can start growing from that. And in the South, that's a non-traditional area. So you're going to you got to keep your base and you got to grow it. And then whether they're going to win or not, again, it's up to the people and it's up to management because good management can help get this done. If you put it in your DNA, as Rick always says, they're going to have a problem. But those people who do not prepare are going to be up against a wall.
Well, you know, Cliff, I tell you what, I want to add on to that. You know, the thing about it is that if you look at the face of the workers across the country, it's changed a lot. It's changed a lot. You see a lot more different minority groups that are like in the South and as you stated, non-traditional states. And I think that's going to increase the organizing also. But once again, I think with the shortened elections, what's going to happen is that, you know, organizing campaigns, as both you and Randy know as well as I do, they're built on, I mean, the breakdown of communications is what causes the organizing campaigns, but they're built on emotion. They're driven by emotion. And how much easier is it going to be to keep emotion, that high emotion level going for 10 days, 15 days, rather than, 38, 39, 40 days? It's going to be much, much easier to keep that emotion going. And once again, once the employer gets hit with the petition, generally it takes a week or 2 weeks just to get them coordinated, just to get them calmed down and to really look at what's happening. I think you're going to find a lot more stealth. I think they're going to hit these employers hard with the real high emotional content in their campaigns, and I think you're going to see a lot more. I mean, it would really surprise me, and as an ex-organizing coordinator, it would really surprise me if they don't take full advantage of that and really just increase the amount of organizing.
And Rick, you have to agree. If you can't win under these circumstances, if you can't organize now,
you can't win.
When are you going to organize?
Absolutely. This is it. This is it. This would be a dream in my past life. This would have been a dream, having a shortened election. And that's why I said, like in Canada, we had a 90-something% win rate in these quick elections. And it was the difference between winning and losing, having those fast elections.
Well, with that doom and gloom picture, what would you tell employers now that are concerned? And we've had conversations. We're hearing from more and more people that want answers on how to be proactive. Randy, what would you say to clients or employers that ask you what can they do to prepare for the quickie elections, and what can they do if it was to be put in place to fight it?
Yeah, I guess first of all, I'd like to make some comments on Cliff's comments and Rick's comments. I think I might be able to give your listeners a little bit more optimism, and maybe that's just because I'm an optimistic guy. But I get clients who call me and they basically say, "Oh my gosh, the sky's falling. What are we going to do?" I mean, if you look at the numbers, guys, unions are still on the decline. I think we're going to see. I think you're right, Rick, that quickie elections are going to put some gas in the tank. I'm not sure how much, but I think to a large degree, unions have been their own worst enemies, and to a certain degree, the board, and I'll touch on that in a second. But unions are still throwing billions of dollars at candidates. That's money that they could be putting in organizing. I don't see that trend continuing. I see the long-term number of organized workers in this country continuing to decline. I think we're going to see a little blip, and certainly in different areas, maybe different parts of the countries, we'll see significant blips. But I think even in those areas, in those parts of the country and industries, we'll see a continued decline. Why do I say the NLRB may be its own worst enemy? Because I think that employees who hear about these issues view them as unfair. I know, at least in the middle part of the country, when employees are walking around talking about the fact, and this has been a few years ago when the Employee Free Choice Act was in Congress. I mean, we're seeing commercials with George McGovern, recognized by just about everybody as being the most liberal guy out there, saying this is unfair, and employees saying the same thing, saying, yeah, that is unfair. So, I see unions as still not putting the money into organizing. Frankly, on the UFCW and the Change to Win thing, I think it's a good thing. I think what that says is the UFCW is saying we're out of here because Change to Win didn't deliver on its big organizing promise. So we might as well go back to the AFL-CIO. So I'm not as alarmist. I think about that slogan during World War II that was in Britain, keep calm and carry on. Now, that doesn't mean keep calm and put your head in the sand or act like nothing's wrong or do nothing. Not at all. Because while that macro view I have is optimistic, on the micro level, if you get that organizing petition, now all of a sudden all these do apply to you, many of which will not be known to your employees. They don't necessarily know about Section 7 rights or the quickie election rule. But if you get that petition, it will have an absolute impact upon you. So while we need to keep calm with all of this stuff that's happening and realizing that it may change over time and that it may not affect us, the carry-on part is to be prepared. Okay? And what that is just good labor relations. Because you could be hit, and if you're hit with an election petition and we've got this quickie rule in place, what are you going to do? I mean, so many of my clients don't even want to utter the word union, that they want to act like if they just ignore it, will go away. And I'm trying to change that mindset to say, guys, you've got to be ready, because if you get that petition, you can't take 6 weeks anymore to educate folks. In your workplace, union-free has got to become part of your vernacular, just like safety and productivity. And you've got to be able to talk about it and be able to deliver. I mean, you've got to make sure that you've got a decent workplace, that you've got good communications. What would you do if you got that petition? Would you have essentially a campaign in the box? Have you trained your supervisors about union issues? What do the supervisors say if an employee says, hey, what do you think about a union? Okay. Have you conducted a union vulnerability audit? With regard to some of these specific things, like the micro, is it maybe time to look at all your job titles and descriptions to avoid maybe or to lessen the chance that you're going to have micro units? Have you looked at your policies to see if they're compliant with Section 7 and don't tend to chill employee organizing rights? You need to do that ahead of time. And that's the biggest thing I see with the quickie election rule is you don't have that luxury of sitting back, not talking about it, hoping that it never comes up. And then if it comes up, having 6 weeks to deal with it. That's gone. You got to be ready.
Well, Randy, I have to agree with you. I mean, it's not 1917, and the Bolsheviks aren't going to march through Red Square here and take over. But I think you're right. There are some things that you can do that are proactive, that you do all the time. The things you just said are standard, and you got to do that now, because you could do it before when you heard about union activity. You could do those things from time to time. Now you got to do it regularly. But if you address your employee relations like you would a flu outbreak, obviously the flu isn't something we all go crazy about, but after World War I, more people were killed by the flu epidemic worldwide than they were by the war. And I think that's what you've got here. You've got a significant threat that's going to come up to employers who want to remain union-free because of the time. And if you do not have preparations, if you're not out there actively going out and inoculating yourself against these potential issues, emotions can drive an organizing drive extremely quickly. Before you know it, you'll be in the midst of a full-blown campaign and have an election set in 10, 12, 14 days. So what could be something that you could go out, take very minimal, regular attempts to try to make sure you know your employees. You go out and do your audits. You review your handbooks, make sure they're current with the new regulations and rules. Monitor the law, the change of it. Those things, if you do regular maintenance, you should be fine. But the employers who don't, who say it can never happen to me, who say, well, that's okay because I'm good to my employees, I know it, I believe I've been good for 50 years, they're going to be the ones that are susceptible to the problems. And what's going to happen in the future is going to be those employers who are stagnant will be left behind, and they will be vulnerable. Some will make it, some won't. But I do think that there's an opportunity, again, for unions to come in and look at the employers who are not taking proactive steps. Your smaller employers to your mid-sized employers are the ones that are going to be targeted the easiest because they don't have the profit, they don't have the margin, and they would save the money on that type of routine maintenance in their mind because they don't need it, because they've never needed it, because they're good to their employees and know their employees, and they're the ones where unions traditionally have the highest win percentage, and now they're the ones that are going to be the hardest hit if there's a quick election.
And you know what? I talk to HR groups all around the country. And what happens a lot of the times, once again, I always say, to stay union free, you have to make, staying union free part of your corporate DNA. But I think what's really important is that to educate your HR people also on exactly what unions are and what they do and the strategies and the tactics that they use. Have them understand, because so many times I go in front of a large group of HR people to talk about union activities and talk about how they can prevent it. And it's almost like I'm going to kindergarten because they absolutely have no knowledge of unions or tactics or any even the 101 very basic stuff. So and having someone who, Cliff, you said monitor. I think what also they have to do is create a system to monitor activity. Because every time we've gone into a campaign, 2 weeks into the campaign, people will say, yeah, we had no knowledge that there was activity. And then a couple of weeks into it, they become a little bit more educated. They understand a little bit more. Then they say, yeah, now that we think about it, there was activity, but we just didn't recognize it as union activity. So having someone who would, designated to receive any information or receive any complaints is, the person who can take that mile-high look and to see if pieces of the puzzle are, pictures coming together is important also. Once again, it's about the day-to-day activity that you have to do and communicating with the people on the ground in the facility. It's not complicated, but it takes dedication. It takes really caring about the issues that your people are experiencing with inside your facility, whether they're real or they're not, they're imaginary. But with union organizing and just good management, perception is reality. So I think it's once again making staying union free part of your corporate DNA and communicating with your people. And I think is the most important step.
When I work with the union, and Rick, you can say this, when I was an attorney there, the campaigns that were successful were the ones where people were angry. And they didn't even have a real good reason to be angry, but they were. It's an emotional issue. And I think that employers will be well served to have management training, professionally done management training, and continually rely upon good managers, because good managers, frontline managers, are your strongest and weakest link depending on how well they're doing their job. Those individuals can communicate back to you what's going on the floor, and you can make educated decisions on where you need to improve, where you need to change, where you need to modify your resources before you go through anything else. And if you don't keep up on your handbook and you don't enforce your handbook, your policies, your regulations, those are the types of things that will fester into an emotional situation. We're all going to have problems, but if you have the ability to have good frontline supervision that can communicate effectively, that can work with employees through tough times and good times, you'll be in a lot better shape.
Gentlemen, that's all the time we have today. Randy, Cliff, Rick, I just wanted to thank you. Tune in next time to PS Labor Talk.